Okay, meanwhile, there is a big piece of election news coming out of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, John Roberts is just a terrible justice. He is. I'm sorry. He thinks that his sole mandate is to somehow preserve in some way the legitimacy of the court. And his way of preserving the legitimacy of the court is to avoid, quote unquote, controversy in the here and now, as opposed to controversy in the later. And he's constantly kicking the can down the road. So on the ACA, he will rewrite the law just so that the Supreme Court is not required to strike down a law that was very controversial. He'll rewrite it just to, quote unquote, reestablish the institutional legitimacy of the Supreme Court. Question, did it help? Answer, no. John Roberts is constantly doing this kind of stuff. So here's a perfect case in point. Yesterday, the Supreme Court refused to take up a case. It split 4-4 on taking up a case on Pennsylvania voting. So here's the underlying fact pattern. In Pennsylvania, there is a law on the books. The law on the books is that you have to vote by November 3rd. Right? November 3rd is not an arbitrary deadline, as Andrew McCarthy points out. It is the election. It's a date fixed by Congress for voting across the country to take place. Okay, well, under the Constitution, states have a great deal of discretion regarding the manner in which elections are conducted, but that discretion is not limitless. The election is November 3rd. Whatever time frame the states allow for early voting, whatever procedures they prescribe for authenticating legitimate mail-in ballots, the voting has to be concluded on November 3rd. The Constitution states it is for Congress to determine the time of choosing the electors, in modern parlance, for conducting in each state the presidential election. The states don't have authority to alter that date. Okay, in Pennsylvania, they just altered the date. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court, says Andy McCarthy from National Review, is enmeshed in politics. Its members are elected, not appointed for 10-year terms. A few weeks back, in a 4-3 ruling along partisan lines with Democrats in the majority, the court nullified the mandate, duly enacted by the state's legislature, that mail-in ballots must be received in the office of the County Board of Elections no later than 8 o'clock p.m. on the day of the primary or election. You know, that law makes perfect sense, right? Because what you would like to do is start counting. So everything has to be received by a certain date. This is something, by the way, that the post office actually warned about months ago. They put out an actual notice to states across the country saying, you know, guys, you really should change your laws so that the final date on which people can send their mail for an election gives enough time for us to deliver that mail such that the thing can be received by the date of the election. The Constitution and federal law, as the Supreme Court has observed, vests discretion to set election rules in the state legislatures, not state courts. And as even the Pennsylvania court conceded, it was within the legitimate power of the state's General Assembly to set this deadline. There was no ambiguity about it, nor any legal infirmity. Right? If you wanted your ballot counted, it had to be received by November 3rd. Yet, the court's Democratic judges dictated a 3-day extension of the lawful deadline for counting mail-in ballots. The vehicle for this act of willful usurpation was a lawsuit brought by surprise, the Pennsylvania Democratic Party. The state court's majority invoked a hurl it at the wall and see what sticks combination of rationales said to flow from COVID, natural disasters, emergency situations, a loopy construction of the state constitution's free and equal elections clause, theorizing that since the virus does not affect all people the same way, provisions the legislature makes to deal with it somehow render elections unfair and unequal. So what does this actually do? What does the court ruling do? The court effectively ruled that you can vote after Election Day. The Pennsylvania court requires election officials to presume that any ballot received by its extended deadline, now November 6th, must be counted, even if it lacks postmark proof it was mailed on or before November 3rd. So you could see an election in which the entire thing comes down to Pennsylvania. In fact, this is quite easy to see because Pennsylvania is a battleground state, right? You could see an election in which Trump replicates all the states that he won except for Michigan and Wisconsin. And now he needs to win Pennsylvania. And Joe Biden needs to win Pennsylvania. And the entire election rests on Pennsylvania. And it's November 3rd. And we don't know the results, right? November 3rd happens, and it's a very tight election in Pennsylvania. Again, right now, that election is within 3 to 4 points, right? It's close to margin of error. And you now have a Pennsylvania law that says that the day after the election, right, November 4th now, everybody looks at the TV, they recognize it comes down to Pennsylvania, and everybody rushes to their mailbox and sends in their ballot. People who didn't vote, they rush to their mailbox, and now they send in their ballot. According to Pennsylvania State Supreme Court, those will be counted if received by November 6th, whether or not they are postmarked late. Even if it lacks postmark proof, it was mailed on or before November 3rd. As Andy McCarthy said, in effect, it greenlights voting after Election Day, even as the national media is reporting the results of a contest that is supposed to be over. For those reasons, the state's Republican Party asked the Supreme Court to stay the court's ruling to the extent it permits voting after Election Day. The Supreme Court adheres to a so-called Purcell principle arising out of its 2006 ruling in Purcell versus Gonzalez that courts must not change the rules for an election late in the game. Purcell is now being flouted not just in Pennsylvania. In Wisconsin, Judge William Conley, an Obama appointee on the federal district court, presumed to rewrite a number of state law election-related deadlines, including extending the deadline for counting absentee ballots until November 9th. In his wisdom, Judge Conley caveated that ballots should only be counted if they are mailed in by Election Day, November 3rd, which sounds fine in theory, but there's going to be a lot of dispute about when ballots were mailed, right? You're going to say, I dropped it off at the post office, I dropped it in a mailbox November 3rd, it wasn't postmarked until November 4th. So did I mail it in on time? So the Supreme Court could have intervened here. The Supreme Court could have done something here. Okay, well, in April, the High Court intervened in a similar Wisconsin case. Judge Conley hadn't just extended by a week after Election Day the deadline for mail-in ballots to be received by state election officials. He had ordered that votes be counted even if they were mailed after Election Day, and the Supreme Court stayed Conley's order. All 4 liberal bloc justices, including now deceased RBG, dissented from the unsigned opinion by a 5-justice majority. The majority concluded that to permit people to keep voting after Election Day would gravely affect the integrity of the election process, but the opinion took pains to emphasize it was forbidding the counting of post-election mail-in ballots because Conley had ordered it unilaterally, i.e. there had been no request for that relief, which suggests that if a party had asked for it, the court might have approved post-election day voting, which is insane. So now the court is essentially saying that they are going to put off decisions on whether or not to count ballots until after Election Day itself. So here's how this is going to go. Let's say that it does come down to what we're talking about. It comes down to Pennsylvania. It comes down to states that have extended their voting deadlines after Election Day, which is crazy, by the way. And now you have a 9th justice on the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett, who's going to be confirmed this week or early next. And now Democrats proclaim that a 5-seat majority on the Supreme Court with Amy Coney Barrett in the majority is illegitimate because Amy Coney Barrett was rammed through. I mean, the possibilities here are devastating. And if you're talking about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, if that's John Roberts' chief concern, I cannot think of anything more calibrated to undermine that legitimacy than what the Supreme Court is doing right here. Facts don't care about your feelings, and it's a fact that The Ben Shapiro Show is the largest conservative podcast in the nation. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to stay up to date on all of our content.